Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chrononauts, a journey through science fiction literature. I am JM, and with me are Anne and Nate. The previous episode we recorded, there were four of us. Yifang, unfortunately, is unable to join us today for the foreseeable future. His commitments at work just got really crazy, so he's still with us in spirit, but the three of us are going to carry on with these episodes and hopefully do a bang-up job. But yes, so we are discussing science fiction literature, and we decided to take an approach that, since the last episode, I've done a little bit of checking and looked into some reference materials and so on. And a lot of the stuff that we're going to be covering today, which is pre-19th century material, can be considered a prototype for the genre, but doesn't get covered very much by historians in this field. And I can sort of see the reasons for that, but we're actually devoting an entire episode to it, which is certainly an unusual approach. We have a lot of material really a huge time period to cover in a short space of time. So we're going to do our best to sort of cover a lot of this material from Antiquity, from the Middle Ages, and going on till the Enlightenment period in the 18th century. 17th, 18th century. And then next time, when we do our follow-up episode, we'll be narrowing our focus considerably. But for today, basically, we are going to take you on a journey of over 1,000 years. So I think the best way to tackle this, again, is sort of going chronologically. And I think that probably the best way to start talking about this is to say that basically the first work that we kind of discussed as a group covering. We threw around a few ideas, the Indian epics, and some other things that we actually don't really know that much about, or at least I don't. But Anne brought up some interesting stuff earlier to do with, what is it, the Mahabharata?
Yeah, the Upanishads, Mahabharata, and
Yeah.
the Ramayana specific.
They're all very, very long.
Yes. So that material is unfortunately pretty unknown to me. But one thing that we came across and that I saw mentioned several times was this work by Lucian of Samosata, written around, was it 160 AD, I believe? It could be off by a few years there.
The date I had written down was 150, but I don't think anybody has an exact.
Nobody knows for sure. Yeah. But maybe if you want, Nate, you could even start us off by talking a little bit about what was going on with the, we're talking about a man who I believe was from Syria.
Yeah, he spoke Syriac as his native tongue, so he was on the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. Being from the Hellenistic portion of the empire, he learned how to speak Greek, which is what he composed his works in, of which he wrote many different satires. This is probably the earliest of the works that could be considered proto-science fiction and not mythology, as this doesn't really, well, it does play with mythology, but in a way it's kind of ironic. But one thing that I think is interesting to come out of the text as far as the ideas of genre and first is he opens up talking about a historian who was very influential at the time. I know I'm not pronouncing this right, but it's Ctesias the Canadian. My pronunciation of ancient names is not very good, but he was very well known to the author, but his works now are entirely lost. So when we talk about people like Lucian and the idea of first and who influenced who, we're dealing with a very incomplete piece of the puzzle of works from antiquity. Works from influential Greek playwrights like Aristophanes and Euripides mostly do not survive. So it is very possible that somebody else during this time wrote some kind of proto-science fiction or something like that we would consider a progenitor of the science fiction genre today. We just have no idea of it actually existing.
So I was wondering about that because it seems like Lucian was being rather facetious about everything. He's just there seems to be a lot of mockery.
Yeah.
Maybe this person was actually somebody he was mocking. Like maybe this is not actually
Right.
like.
And he talks about Herodotus too, whose works do survive. And he again plays with the idea of what is truth and what isn't truth, because Herodotus treated the historical course of man as being influenced by the gods, which was written probably about 500 to 600 years before Lucian's time, where that kind of idea was less common. One thing that really jumped out at me reading the text is the way he describes certain battle scenes. It very much reminded me of a satire on Thucydides and other military historians at the time. Just the way he's setting the whole conflict up, the war between the sun and the earth, as a large military conflict that arises out of these obscure colonial rights, and the major powers get sucked in. It reminded me a lot of a take on Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War.
But it just seemed, I don't know, again, I don't have a lot of background reading in this kind of stuff, so I could be wrong, but it just seemed like he was sending up the entire thing.
Yeah,
he's
exactly.
Like, there's these 50,000 of these kind of weird vegetable people, and there's 50,000 of these giant guys riding on these things, throwing poisonous turnips at people, and it's just, and there was 100,000 of them too, and our right flank marched against their left flank, and it just seemed very I don't know, like a send up really, and it was almost much ado about nothing, kind of like we got so many so many soldiers, and all the weirdness that he's describing is just so matter of fact, that nobody comments on anything, in fact, until a weird point later in the book, which I'll bring up in a bit. But I thought it was interesting because so they go to the moon after having a couple of other adventures first, encountering some lusty tree women, and there's a big tempest, and they get blown off into the sky and sail on the wind to the moon, where they meet Endymion, and he's basically I guess he's a human from Earth, but somehow he got to be king of the moon. I don't know if they really describe how that happens. I think they might later. But he has these, him and the king of the sun, or the sun people, they want to colonize Venus. And so they have a war over it. And Lucian and his men just sort of join in, spontaneously. It's sort of strange, I mean, it feels very detached. I guess, maybe from my modern perspective, I feel like there should be more interactions and stuff like that, but that's just not the way not the way they would have written it back then anyway, even if it wasn't a send-up. So,
works like Plutarch and Arianus, where they talk about these ancient battles, especially where Alexander is, steamrolling everybody, and there's tens of thousands of people killed. It's all written very dryly, this commander took the right flank and they engaged with these portions, and here are the casualties. There's really not that much a sense of urgency in the way that battle and military scenes are described in those works, and the send-up of it, of the military units just being thoroughly ridiculous and surreal, I think works really well here.
And I guess that's his commentary on that. He makes it he uses that dry style but he's like, yeah, they're throwing like poison turnip missiles and weaving spider webs so that I guess the soldiers can easily move between the planetary bodies and things like that. And it's kind of cool. What interesting thing would be, I guess, the conception that they would have had of the planets and stuff. They call it the Morning Star, but I think they're actually talking about Venus, right?
I'm not sure exactly. I don't really know what models of the solar system would have been known to kind of common people at the time, as there were several different proposed models during the Hellenistic period. Somebody, I'm blanking on their name, did propose a heliocentric model, I think under Ptolemy's reign, but
Right.
it wasn't taken seriously by people at the time.
But it doesn't seem that Lucian takes it very seriously
Yeah,
because
right.
the sun to him is just another planetary body, pretty much. Like and there's people living there, and they can wage war against the moon people, which is all the stellar bodies are pretty much equivalent to each other almost.
I felt the piece is very satiristic of things that would be happening during the time period. So it's not just like kind of like going against like or making a satire of the other writers of the time, but also like society at the time. I mean, when he goes to that planet where it has the oil lamp people,
Yeah.
and it's a really fascinating thing because the oil lamps is what you would typically in that time period associate with slaves and with common people, and they don't have equal rights. And then here on this place, they do have equality, and they're all walking around like it's okay, and that's like so ludicrous to him. Oh my gosh, and it's almost like terrifying and scary because it's like the lower class or the slave class having autonomy and rights. And I mean, I recall that being like something that stood out to me was like just the context of reality at that time, and then how that was something so spooky to him. And I think that was a very satiristic point that he was making.
Yeah. Definitely seems to be part of it.
Yeah, Lucian is pretty quite cutting with his satire. I've only read one other work of his, and it's a similar structure where he just kind of travels around for a while, but he doesn't get quite as far in that one. He just flies around the mountains and converses with the gods and stuff.
So I guess, are we considering this as a work of science fiction, and why is it science fiction?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily consider it science fiction of itself because there's not really too much discussions of science there. However, it does form the earliest known example we have of what the critical intro to the 1894 edition of the text refers to as the imaginary traveler. Which is what all of the works we'll be discussing tonight fall in, which is essentially the plot construction of a regular-ish person. Either by pure chance they invent a device, or divine
They get hit on the
intervention.
head.
Actually, it sends them to a faraway place, and they use the journey as an opportunity to explore either different areas of satire, different areas of political thought, different areas of utopic futurism.
What really stood out to me as far as like what all of these pieces end up having in common was just that change in perspective. And I think that's where the science comes into the fiction, is when, especially in the Age of Enlightenment, when we start to get to those stories, you have a shift in technology, you have a shift in the focus, like how society is structured, and it's changing really rapidly. And then all of a sudden you have a need, because you have the religion on one side, you have science on the other, and every single one of these stories juxtaposes itself right in between needing to make a statement that we need to change perspective or change the way we see and view things, or that we are stuck in between a past and a future, being in the present. And I think that that's really clear as we talk about all of these books. I think that's really what starts to stand out as the science fiction portion of it, because it relates to the present time.
Right, and even if there's not necessarily human agency through engineering or plot devices revolving around futuristic ideas of technology, they do have a wide vision of man, of man's place in the cosmos, both in terms of space and time. And some of these works are really very forward-thinking and as far as future-looking.
So definitely a lot of the works that we're covering today have elements of satire, and that actually seems to be something that's carried on in science fiction up till the present day. There's definitely a lot of use of extraterrestrial worlds and future times and the imaginary traveler kind of motifs to comment on the present age, whatever age that happens to be in. And it's I suppose it's a very good vehicle for satire. Is science fiction really? Another thing in common that.
Science fiction is like the face that is the most humane and the most human of all literature, I feel, because it really does deal with the human condition and the conditions of which humans live in. And so that's why that satire fits really nicely into the genre, I think.
Yeah, and you can see right up until something I read fairly recently, which is I think written in the 50s. It's called The Space Merchants, and it's basically it's by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth, and it's like a satire of what they thought, I guess, corporate America specifically, where it was heading in the 50s, and it's really, it's kind of on point, like it's kind of crazy what they imagined would be happening in a few decades, like the coffee is now super addictive, and if you don't drink it, you'll die, kind of thing, but like it's obviously something that's a tradition that's been carried on for a long time, is doing satires and doing a social commentary based on that kind of extrapolation. And the early works too have this, moving away from satire for a second, but they have this imagination in common where they create inventions. And there's not a lot in the Lucian, but there is a magic mirror. That seems to be a trend that definitely carried on. I think even in the Canterbury Tales, there's somebody showing off. Like there's a scene where some guests are showing their gifts, and one is a magic mirror that can basically show you anything in the world. And at one point, the imaginary traveler of the Lucian has the ability to look through such a device and sees all his friends and his family and stuff like that down on the earth. He doesn't really seem to know if they can see him, though, so obviously it's probably just one-way communication, but it's still pretty cool. One thing that I thought was... Sorry?
I was going to say, so what's our next story on the thing, just to keep it rolling, because we have quite a few to get through.
Yeah, I think next up would be the Middle Ages, moving on to just basically talking about how a lot of the works at that time were kind of religious reflections of the world. Both Dante's Paradiso, where Dante ascends through the heavens to essentially meet God, and a couple stories from Arabian Nights, which have a similar construct, and it seems very unlikely to me that Dante wasn't openly influenced by Arabian Nights, considering everybody else in the Western world pretty much was, given that the Arabs did preserve a lot of the writings of ancient civilization.
So one story, I before we move on a little bit, I just wanted to bring up one thing that I thought was interesting about the Lucian that we didn't talk about, and it's part of this. They go through a whole bunch of other adventures, but at one point they go through this city called Lignopolis, and it's full of lamps, sentient lamps, and they're basically like they have lives of their own, and they talk about people and stuff like that. And the idea is that at night the lamps sort of fly off into this Lignopolis and congregate together and talk about things and make plans. And for some reason, the people on the Lucian's crew are really scared, and they've seen all these weird moon things and all these vegetable human hybrids, and none of that stuff seemed to faze them at all. But the city of lamps actually did seem to bother them.
I did.
And
I said that is a satire. I mentioned the people and why they were scary.
I actually wondered if Lucian was actually making a comment there about slavery.
That's exactly what I
And
said.
yeah, 'cause well, he's like talking about that these everyday objects that we take for granted and that are normal part of everyday use might actually have some ulterior thing and might be plotting against us. And that was sort of unexpected because I don't know, they seemed actually more bothered by that than all the crazy goings on the moon.
Well, yeah, because you wouldn't want the lower class to uprise against you because they are just common objects.
Right, and I think there was maybe a comment there about how a slave is your property and that's his purpose. That's what he was born for. So when they step out of line, it means the empire must be in a lot of trouble, I guess.
So one other thing, I guess, before we move on, two quick issues that I thought were interesting, not necessarily related to sci-fi, but he specifically addresses the Homeric question, that is, who was Homer, when were the Iliad and the Odyssey written?
Oh, yes.
And Homer tells him the answer, which is not consistent with modern scholarship. Homer tells Lucian that the Odyssey was written first. Modern scholarship is that the Iliad was written about 50 years before.
Yeah.
And the other thing, he does paint Achilles and Patroclus as lovers. I pulled out the quote here. For their manner of venery and copulation, thus it is, they couple openly in the eyes of all men, both with females and male kind, and no man holds it for any dishonesty.
Interesting. I wonder actually if that. So I actually read. I started out by I found a version of the true history that wasn't the version that eventually I think we all ended up reading, which was, I believe, the translation from 1894.
No, this is the 1894 edition, but the translation was from the 1500s.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I saw, so I had this other version, and then it seemed like the translator was I can't remember what his name is, Dr. Frankel or something like that, and the introduction actually said that he removed some lewd parts of the text.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and they said that like it was a good thing, like because they said, well, thank God he removed that vulgar stuff, and so I'm guessing it had to do with the tree women copulating and all
so.
the copulation references and stuff like that. They didn't really want that in the 1800s, I guess. So
Yeah. But overall, I really like this one a lot. So I guess now should we move on to something that's a little more morally uptight?
Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to bring up the lamp thing because I thought it was pretty interesting.
I had brought up the lamp thing, but you totally just... You weren't listening to me because I'm a female. I understand.
Oh, man. So, yes, Dante, I believe.
Yeah, Dante and I think the Arabian Nights are a nice little brief contrast with each other because they both, in Bulukia anyway, go through kind of a extraterrestrial journey through that religious construction of the solar system. And Dante obviously goes in a lot more detail than the Arabian Nights stuff, but it's interesting how they both have a very similar construct, both in terms of the model of the solar system, use of alchemy, like weird creatures and magic and stuff like that. And also in the City of Brass, we see early automata.
Yes. Self-moving puppets and other creatures. And it seems like that was actually a pretty common idea for a while there, that you could make something like that.
Right.
And obviously, you would think it was far beyond the grasp of science at the time, but it seems to be something that was thought of by many different writers.
Right, and a lot of it is magic and alchemy based.
Necromancy.
And I think you see a lot of this, not necessarily as a focus, but kind of in the background of the medieval King Arthur stories, both in terms of Mallory and Christian de Troyes and things like that. There's all kinds of weird magic and odd creatures and these kind of surreal events. But I think the connection to science fiction here is really the idea of their construct of the universe. Dante in particular spells it out in Paradiso, where it's a geocentric model of the solar system, with the Earth being the dead center of the solar system, and in the center of the Earth is hell, and in the center of the Earth is Satan. And God sits at kind of a fixed outer layer of the solar system, like the exterior of a sphere. So Satan is the furthest physical point from God in the universe. And in Paradiso, Dante ascends, or Paradiso, I keep adding that extra I in there. Dante ascends through the different heavens, the heaven of the moon and the heaven of the sun and Venus and all this, before he reaches the final layer. So we kind of have that imaginary traveler narrative applied to the solar system in a religious fashion.
And it's very specifically laid out.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's not vague at all in describing what the properties of these bodies in the solar system are, and how everything above the moon is, I guess, more holy than everything underneath it.
Yeah.
So
and it's increasing layers of holiness, and you meet the various people through history and Dante's own time who would have, in his opinion anyway, found their way there.
Which Dante's first guide cannot do, because he's not a Christian.
Virgil, the author of the Aeneid. And
that's right.
Not quite a contemporary of Lucian, but almost.
Almost, anyway. Yeah. But I mean, it's definitely kind of a little off topic for the podcast. But another thing that I sort of noticed was about the Lucian was that his illusion seemed very, very Greek and not Roman. But I guess that has to do with where he was from specifically,
right,
in the Empire. So, but yeah, that poor Virgil there can't get up to paradise.
Yeah.
But he's so good about it too. He doesn't seem to have any malice or anything like that.
No, he certainly is a good sport about it. I think he's grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, somebody to talk to, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So there's an interesting parallel between. I don't actually have quotes with me, but maybe if we do this in a few episodes' time, there's actually a book written in the early 1930s by a British science fiction writer named Olaf Stapleton, and it's called The Star Maker, and it is a huge influence on Arthur C. Clarke and many other science fiction writers. And it's basically it is basically an imaginary travel kind of story. We do learn a little bit about the protagonist, but not that much. But the allusions to the Divine Comedy are really pretty blatant now that I think about it. I think the book even starts out very, very similarly to Inferno. So it's cool. It would be a nice little parallel when we get there. Probably not for a while yet, but it's kind of a book that I think we should talk about because it's pretty important.
And so how does that tie into the Arabian Nights when we're going on to that topic?
So there's I think we already mentioned the City of Brass story. That's an expedition to a city, and the city contains many automata, and it's ultimately not really what I was expecting, because I thought it would kind of be like I thought it would be sort of a condemnation, I thought it would be unholy or something like that, and it's really not. So it's I guess there's been a lot written about how Arabia was the center of science for quite some time, and there was the book that we kind of came across in some of our readings by we didn't actually read this, but it was
difficult to find English translations of a lot of his works.
Autodidactus, that's what it was, right?
Yeah.
And and it's supposed to be a book written by an actual, well, we call it a scientist. And I have this written down. No, now I'm gonna want to find it, but it's gonna take too long. So I should have these notes handy. But this,
About the Arabian Nights that was really cool was that, like science fiction, one of the reasons why it was a really interesting thing to have happen was because it was for pure entertainment. If she didn't tell a story, she got her head cut off,
Yeah,
right?
right. And it had to be good.
It had to be good, and she had to keep the interest of the Sultan or whoever it was that was making her do this. And I think that's why they probably didn't have so much of that religious context or that much of a need to prove something, because it wasn't for the public, it was for somebody who is already gluttonous and wanted something and was like, if you don't tell me stories, I'm going to kill you. So she really had that investment to make it something interesting. So I bet you she kind of went through her whole entire brain just to come up with City of Brass humans.
And this reminded me a lot in style and tone more about like King Arthur, epic knight poetry stuff than anything from Antiquity.
yes, it's definitely has a different character to it, and I don't know, the stories are pretty compelling. Sorry, my something is broken on my technology end, and I can't seem to do what I need to do to access my notes, so I can't get the name of that person, but we'll put it in the show notes, probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, we're saying that there's like this history throughout history as we start to transcend text. We're going through a changing construct of like what the solar system is, and how people viewed science, and how people viewed the stars, and how they story told, and how all of those things started to formulate what is that proto-science fiction.
Right, and as the empires change and develop and emerge themselves out of the Dark Ages, the Arabians being the first to really kind of spark, I wouldn't say it's the pre-Renaissance, but it's kind of the more...
elevated thought.
Right, elevated levels of thought, science, math, and engineering, kind of a direct continuation of what the Western Roman Empire was doing before the collapse. So the Arabian conquest spread through the eastern part of, I guess, the West, and then the Ottoman Empire would take a lot of that territory, whereas the Catholic Church would dominate the West and most of Europe through Dante's time. And then the Reformation, I think, is the really big historical event in Europe that sparks kind of the next wave of these kind of stories. We covered 5 stories from this period, 4 from the 1600s and then 1 from the mid-1700s. Johannes Kepler's Somnium from 1608, Bacon's New Atlantis from 1628, Godwin's Man on the Moon from 1638, Cyrano de Bergerac, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Comical
Cyrano!
History. Yeah. Comical History of the States and Empires of the Moon from 1657, and then his subsequent The States and Empires of the Sun from 1662, and then Voltaire's Micromegas from 1752. So this is kind of right on the heels of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, which brings a lot of new ideas spurned by astronomical developments made by Copernicus, Brahe, and even Kepler himself. I guess with that, let's talk about the Enlightenment.
So let's
Where are we going to start with? Are we going to start with?
Let's start with Kepler.
Okie doke.
I know that Kepler is actually a very significant figure in astronomy. Am I right about that? I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think he was the elliptical guy.
Kepler was a student of Tycho Brahe in Prague, and the character in the story is very much a self-insert for Kepler himself. As far as his discoveries, the laws of planetary motion is what Wikipedia says in the time that I'm quickly looking at it here.
Yeah, he came up with the
Yeah.
elliptical orbit
Okay.
versus a circular orbit, I believe.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
think he also had a different idea of how, I think he was more heliocentric, if I'm, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, and that was a very controversial idea that we'll see in some of the later works.
Yes.
But as far as all of these pieces go, I think this one has some of the most beautiful prose as far as describing not only the method of travel here, but as far as the moon goes itself and the speculation of alien life.
Oh,
Yeah, that
absolutely.
that definitely was seemed very picturesque. Although I wondered about the translation, but I mean that's just because it seemed unexpectedly difficult to even like. It seems like this work is not that known.
No, it doesn't seem to be. I found a copy of the scan of the original folio in Latin, and there's a amateur project that attempts to translate the entire thing. It's like 80% done, and there was another translation that I found that completes it. But the last 20% or so was like really bad, and it almost looked like somebody ran it through Google Translate or something like that.
Electronic translator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really
But
quick for people who don't know what this is, can we like kind of give a quick synopsis of the story? I mean,
Sure.
because if we
Okay,
talk
yeah.
about it, we're going to talk about it. But I mean, people might want to know what it's about.
So it was kind of inspired by both Lucian and some passages from Plutarch and his own work. The character, who's an insert for Kepler himself, works for Tycho Brahe, and then is relayed this kind of story of a dream, or in a dream, of transportation to the moon by means of demon flight.
Which is awesome name for a band.
Yes.
And then from the moon, it goes into these very mathematical descriptions of the geography of the moon, to the point where it almost reads like a physics textbook in places. But there's lots of speculation on the nature of alien life and other worlds, without any trace of kind of the social satire we see in almost all the other works that we're reading from this time period, as well as Lucian, but rather this is pure scientific speculation.
I'm going to say I
And-
felt like this was the hardest science of the science fiction that we
absolutely.
read.
Yeah.
And it really read like a hard science. It was highly
Yeah.
narrative, but it was...
His background gives him the ability to do that.
Yeah, like, so he basically almost, I felt like he used it as a platform to kind of exercise his ideas that he was thinking about at the time in a really safe way. Because it was in a fictitious, dream-like story, he can say whatever he wants and not have to worry about getting persecuted or God only knows what. But it was really cool because it was hard science, but then it also didn't take a religious tone. It took a naturalistic witch tone, or like a magic, as like the contrast to it, with his mom being almost like this magician or witch that already had these powers, and she already knew about all these things, you know? So I think that contrast was really cool, and it was nice to see a non-religious text from this era.
Kepler's mother herself was accused of being a witch and actually went on trial. And this is at the time where there were very real consequences for pursuing these ideas, which the church might deem heretical. Being burned at the stake is pretty good motivation not to pursue a
pretty much
heliocentric model of the universe.
Well, and then it's interesting because, I mean, I think I was lost my thought there, but like the idea that he was almost de-villainizing the quote-unquote witchcraft by giving it something
that's a good way to
parallel in the science. So we found out all these things from Tycho Brahe, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And here my mom has been doing this the whole time. She's just happy that I finally learned all her tricks, even though it was from a scientist. But it really validates that they're not witchcrafts, they're not magicians, they're not evil. They're just people of science in a different way.
Well, it's interesting
That's
that
how I
even thought to speculate on such things, though, without having any ulterior purpose, any need to depict a social satire. It seems pretty ahead of its time in that respect.
I remember telling you too, I felt reading it that it had the same narrative pace, kind of, as like reading an H.P. Lovecraft story. Where like it's not exactly the same, but it kind of has that like
The Dream Quest kind of.
the Dream Quest type story where
and
it
almost
realism in it.
cosmic horror, if you want to think about it. I mean, these like moon demons are transporting their way through different dimensions to get to the Earth and going through the dream world and all that. It is very otherworldly.
Very otherworldly, cosmic. Yeah. And of course, a lot of the depictions, like the later depictions of magic in fiction and stuff, were really when they try to make it sort of pseudoscientific, like the way Jack Vance does. He'll say, well, it's basically knowing the formula to summon demons from another dimension to get them to do your bidding for you. And so he tries to, link it in with mathematics and stuff like that, too. By the way, I found the name of that person finally. It's Ibn al-Nafis, who is also a scientist. He wrote the Theologus Autodidactus in 1270, and that is, he called it a theological novel dealing with various concepts and trying to describe them in a scientific way, including things like spontaneous generation, the afterlife, resurrection, apocalyptic themes, and biology and eschatology. So seems like it would cover a lot of ground, and I was kind of interested in checking that out, but again, it was a little bit beyond the scope. But there's another person who had a bit of scientific background and would have probably put in a lot of as much actual scientific background as he could have in 1270 to describe the processes he was attempting to describe.
Do we have anything else to say about Kepler?
I think this was my favorite of the 1600 stories.
I agree.
I
liked it.
I just loved his approach he took.
It was really, it was a lot more beautiful, I guess, and a lot more glorious, I guess, in a way.
Yeah.
Not so, not something like the New Atlantis, which I guess we could cover next.
Yeah, right. So that was coincidentally my least favorite of the 1600 stories.
It was really short, though.
Yeah, it was quite short.
Yeah.
So this one, again, Bacon was kind of a natural scientist guy. But this one is far less fantastical than the others and is more of a kind of scientifically advanced utopia type society where he goes on these long religious screeds.
Yeah. Yeah, and basically he shows up in this place. They treat him really, really nicely and take him everywhere and explain all these glorious secrets that they have in this place run by the descendants of Solomon or whatever, and that his country doesn't have. So it's very superior, moralistic, the inventions and the things that he described were definitely very forward thinking. But there wasn't really, there's not really a lot of story there or anything. So I'm glad that it was short. But I thought that actually for just the sheer flight of the imagination and to think where science could be in a few hundred years' time if humans just sort of concentrated on what Bacon seemed to think that we needed to concentrate on, it was pretty cool, actually. I don't know about the whole utopian aspect and the whole look at these Jews, aren't they really nice? Aren't they respect Christ?
Yeah,
I don't know. There was definitely some weird stuff in there.
It was very religiously heavy-handed for me. I felt it preachy. I think if I took that preachiness out and I was to get to the core, like you said, John, about like what the point was that look at what we can do when we kind of give up being assholes and we start to just be very moral and very fair. And I think that was like the point of it, was like living a moral life and a just life. And he really went on and on about how you're supposed to be in order to achieve things. And the latter part, the last page, was describing all these fantastic sciences and all these fantastic things like immunizations and food and everything you can imagine.
Medical science.
They came from a moral standpoint. And I guess I felt kind of bad for Bacon, because if he was alive now, he'd be like, oh my God, you have inoculations, and you have food, and you have cars, and you have all these things, and you have all these scientific tools. Wow, you've reached utopia, and yet you're protesting and breaking windows, and the president's having intercourse with people, and we're not moralistic. And so I think he'd be like really sad to be like walking around going, wow, look at what you have. And then look at how you are.
The word utopia had already been coined by this time.
Right.
It was Thomas More in his novel, or if you could call it a novel, I guess. Utopia,
more of a novella, maybe.
Yeah, 1516 or thereabouts, I think.
Yeah, about a century before all this stuff, I think.
Right, about a century before. And his utopia is a little bit more ambiguous than Francis Bacon's. Like, it sounds good. It sounds like it'd be a pretty nice place to live, but, there's the whole thing about the way that they're basically always trying to expand to the next island, and how they won't fight, but they're perfectly happy to use gold, which they don't care about, to hire mercenaries, and basically use them to conquer whatever the next island that isn't the perfect utopia is. So they're always expansionist, and there's still, there's still this element of, it's probably nice, but it's maybe not nice for everybody. Like, maybe there is a dark side to this utopia. Bacon doesn't seem to really care about that at all. But again, he's not really writing a story. He's basically just saying, and even my when I listened to this, there was a thing at the end that was basically just a summary of all the scientific achievements. Yeah, that was there. He called it something, so I think it was actually part of the original text. I can't remember what it was. It was like a separate section, the second very short section of the book where he just sort of cataloged everything. And the book, it says at work unfinished, but I'm actually wondering if it was finished, and maybe that the subtitle is actually a reference to the work of the human, like he was saying, our endeavors are yet unfinished, so we haven't reached New Atlantis. Like, it seemed like the work was finished.
Yeah, I don't know. I raised the point of looking up why it was unfinished last time, but I was so unimpressed by the work that I guess I didn't. I meant to look into that.
I wouldn't recommend our readers necessarily going into this, but if they do, a good way to look at it is it's juxtaposed in between change and history. And I think as we start to look at the next few texts, you'll see that it's kind of a bridge, and it's in between this heavily religious to then now becoming more modern and in thought.
Right, and England certainly at the time was very religious. You were liable to be executed for more or less any minor offense. Very conservative society, especially compared to the French and the Spanish, which we will see later on.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly what Bacon's position on this is, but he seems to be more pro-European.
Clearly, he's a privileged white male in this.
Well, yeah,
that's how I saw it.
But I mean, he seems like it seems to me like, even though he was an Englishman, maybe he.
Did you read how he described Native Americans?
Yeah. So yeah, I was expecting a little. Maybe I was expecting to be taken a little bit more by that. But like I said, it was short, and I can't say I disliked it because it was an interesting flight of fancy for a short while, and it didn't really get much into the social implications of anything. So it was I don't know. I guess since it seems to be cited a lot, I kind of thought maybe there would be a little bit more to it, but in the end, I'm not disappointed that I read that.
Yeah, I think it falls in the category of more interesting than good.
Yeah. Shall we move on to
The Other Englishman.
Godwin? Yes, Francis Godwin. Yeah.
So I really liked the weird, almost German style of 16th or 17th century English, where every noun is capitalized, and the archaic spellings. It really made this for a fun read. So here we have another traveler story going to the moon. We have this odd construction of birds chained together, where he builds this
that was really strange
chariot apparatus, and a couple dozen birds fly him to the moon. He does give direct confirmation and support of Copernicus' model of Earth rotating on the axis, but does not go as far as embracing his heliocentric novel, saying, "I will not go so far as Copernicus, who makes the sun the center of the Earth and immovable." Then he just kind of explores the moon. We get more utopian stuff. Then he lands in China, and we see some early examples of Orientalism.
Yes.
And then, for some reason, there's an odd travelogue of Tenerife at the end that's just tacked on that really doesn't have anything to do with anything.
It's just
there.
We're not a very organized piece of writing, I guess.
No. It is pretty picaresque in tone, in that the character is very roguish, getting in these morally gray misadventures as he goes. And some of the English is really quite funny. I made a note of this one line. My canary wine was turned and stunk like horse piss.
Yeah, I remember that. So I started by reading this, and I was just having a little bit of a, it was a bit of a struggle with the scanning and different things. So I actually switched to an audio version. And it was not that great to listen to either. The narration was, he tried his best, but I don't know, just something about the audio quality was kind of putting me off a bit. But he really got into it. He actually did some singing. That was kind of cute. It's a bleeper box recording on YouTube if anybody's curious to check it out. They seem to do more than I thought, because it's kind of hard to find representations of some of this stuff, but so it was pretty good. It took me a while to get into this. It was pretty slow to start, I thought, and there was a lot of random digressions and stuff like that, and it seemed to come from a really strange. I couldn't really figure out Godwin and where he was, where his background was with a lot of this stuff. So and I didn't actually do any research on him as a person. So I don't know. I don't know what his background was. He
wasn't he a bishop?
Yeah, it's and the name like
or
there's
son
some
of a bishop or something. Wasn't he heavily involved in the church?
Yeah, that's something that I was kind of interested in, because it just seemed like most of the other names that we're kind of covering of the people who write this stuff. They have some kind of background in science or philosophy, or and then this Godwin, I just I don't know. He definitely was an influence on Cyrano and Bergerac.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
Wikipedia says he was a bishop of Llandaff.
There you go.
I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I'm sure it's a Welsh Celtic sounding name, in Hereford. So I don't know if that's 2 bishoprics, however the Church of England worked back then. But he also did some historic work, looks like in Latin. So he would have been fluent in Latin as well.
Got a Master's of Arts degree.
Yes. So this work though was
divinity. Wow, he's a doctor of divinity. I don't know what that means.
Yeah. Then this work was written in English originally, right? With the this somewhat Germanic style, as Nate said, and lots of sort of unusual spellings and capitalizations and so on.
So I want to say this is really interesting. As we've read a lot of these books, one of the things, like when I research them, Almost every single one of them, it says somewhere in my research, considered one of the first science fiction books. Or like and it's interesting because like, okay, aren't they all then kind of science fiction books? Because there is a lot of that where these books are attributed to being like proto-science fiction novels. And then even some of them where I don't see a lot of that science fiction in there.
Yeah, that's the problem with history, is you should never say the F word. You should always say an early example of something, not the first.
Right, because chances are you're always wrong.
Yeah. And
even
it's a completely bold claim to make, especially, going back to what we were talking about, Lucian. There's lots of lost works out there, so somebody could have written something and we would just have no idea that it even existed. So, who's to say what was the first and what wasn't?
Well, some people even say Gilgamesh is the first science fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's got all these different constructs, but then again, they say that it's not. So
sure. And even just, I was just talking to Nate about this earlier, but it seems commonly pretty much held generally that moving forward, quite a bit forward in time now, but that H.G. Wells was the first person to actually invent the concept of a time machine. But in fact, it turns out a Spanish writer named Enrique Rimbaud did it first. And it's a bit of a cheat because it turned out to be a dream, but he still invented a time machine in literature before Wells did. And that is something that nobody seems to talk about. So, yeah, maybe when we get on to the episode about Wells and stuff, we can talk about that a bit more.
That's some foreshadowing.
Yes, lots of foreshadowing in this episode. Yeah. So, you want to talk about Bergerac?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, I enjoyed the Bergerac, the Voyage to the Moon, quite a bit. I thought it was pretty cool. It was funny, and there was there was a bit more conflict than I was expecting. And I feel like in some of these things, there just isn't there's not a lot of struggle. It's people wandering around having things explained to them, right? And I think it's nice to have a little bit of tension to grab onto sometimes. And definitely when we move on to Shelley, we'll see a lot of that because, it's an actual novel with characters and everything, and people have things to say and think, and there's drama and conflict and stuff. And
this one definitely is very influenced by Godwin. In fact, the hero of this one meets the hero from Godwin's work on the moon. Where else? The setup of it is very similar, where he gets to the moon by this wacky device of effervescent vials. Again, I don't know if that's more efficient or less efficient than bird chain.
It seems to blast off with quite a conflagration, though, and I thought that was pretty funny. That the villagers took it into the square and they were going to set fire to it, and he's like, "That's my machine!" And it's like, and then and the thing ended up falling away from him, and he just blasted off to the moon without the machine in the end, and survived.
I was really confused with what they meant by "do." Was they I kept reading it, going, "You mean like dew bottles, from the plants?" And then I kept imagining scientifically in my mind, what would that be? So it heats up, and I'm like, did he try to fly via evaporation?
Yeah, I mean, it could almost be interpreted as an early theory of rocketry. I mean, you're doing something and propelling it out the other end. I mean, it sounds very silly the way he's writing it.
Right, but I think he's also trying to be funny.
Yeah, right.
So,
but it's a very interesting image. So going to the moon, he goes one step further than Godwin, and here he clearly advocates for the heliocentric model, and says, to this may be added the unsupportable pride of mankind, who persuade themselves that nature hath only been made for them, as if it were likely that the sun, a vast body 434 times bigger than the earth, had only been kindled to ripe their medlars and plumpen their cabbage.
Right.
No, in fact, the sun has people on it too.
Yeah, right.
Well, this is one of those transitional pieces again, where
absolutely.
We have the clear delineation. This is no longer God, this is science, and we're not the center of the earth. And I think in the next few works that we talk about, it's going to be very clear that a perception change is what is happening. And that
definitely
really leads us into our first science fiction novel, is that perception change and the societal change that I think you really see in this piece.
And I think what's really interesting here is he takes it beyond our solar system too. He says, I believe the planets are worlds about the sun, and that the fixed stars are also suns which have planets about them. And I think this is the first mention of really ideas of interstellar constructs of multiple solar systems that we see in any of these works.
Yeah.
Because I think most of them are operating on the idea that it's kind of a fixed system and that the stars are just kind of like background on some kind of outer sphere.
Yeah, the Lucian does have people coming from the Dog Star and stuff like that, but it's mentioned like the Dog Star could be down the road or something like that. Like
well, I actually wrote down that same exact quote.
Nice.
Because it was, because it was really interesting, because it was the first time I had ever read something where it said that it wasn't fixed stars. It was other solar systems. It is other planetary bodies that have the same job as our sun that is giving life to planets that are similar. And it really started to take us from the maximum, like we are everything, down to an infinitesimally small. And I think it started to actually, in that way, bring about concept of physics into the genre.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't even know if in their scientific writings, the astronomers like Kepler and Brahe speculated on extrasolar objects. It'd be interesting to look into. But yeah, I think this is the first time I've ever heard of any mention of other solar systems in any work.
Ooh. So I had a really good one on this one too. Sorry. I really love this. This was really fun for me to read, actually. So one of the things that I saw, I don't know why this got into my head, but he had a Promethean reference. I don't have it written down. I think I have a lot of notes, but he did have a Promethean reference, and we do see this, and we are going to continue to see this concept of Prometheus. And, you know, when you think about, like, going back to Greeks, Prometheus, you know, stole magic from the gods or whatever, and then he shared it with everybody. Well, in science, they do this too. They kind of keep going and stealing enlightenment, or they're changing and they're growing and they're becoming less underneath God and more gods themselves. So in some ways, that Promethean idea is the humans, as they attain more and more technology and more intellect and more understanding, but they're actually taking away the power of the gods. And they're not sharing it, but what happened during this time period was the scientific, what's that called? Scientific method. The scientific method started to come about, and that became the new model of we have just stolen from the gods. And I think I kind of got a little of that in this, and maybe I was reading into it too much.
No, I think that's definitely, that was definitely going to be a perception that was bandied about around the time, and even you know, when Shelley named her, subtitled her novel "The Modern Prometheus," that's what she was thinking of, and obviously we'll get to that. But and you know, and then there's I mean, there's obviously this feeling among a lot of, I think, the people that we're discussing today, that's a good thing, even though some of them are quite religious people. You know, they seem to embrace the gifts, the Promethean gifts, as being a good thing for humanity. Maybe some of them
just say cut their heads off, because that seems to happen a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they're elitist about it. Like maybe you know, maybe the gift shouldn't be given to everyone. Maybe only to our specific nations or our specific peoples. But yeah, even like the Francis Bacon, you know, it seems it's not as Anglo-centric as I would have expected. Anyway, so but yeah, and Bergerac does come up with some pretty cool inventions. I don't know if he's the first to do so or what, but actually one thing I thought was kind of cool was that his friend, the sun person that lives on the moon, gives him a book, and it's a book called The Empires of the Sun, not the sequel to this book, presumably.
Yeah, there's some
That
major
would have been
continuity
a
error in the
cool.
universe.
Yeah, that would have been a cool kind of early meta twist there if that had been the case, but no. But it's a book about life on the sun, I guess, and it's an audiobook. So that was kind of cool. You have to wind it up with a bunch of complicated string mechanisms and stuff, and then it just plays the book to you.
Yeah, he really does go through the gamut of natural sciences. He talks about the philosophy of mechanical physics, and still based on elements and humor's understanding of the world. But we have different states of being, which he uses cabbages and insects as an
Yeah.
example, which is kind of a precursor to microbial theories. There's some discussion on atomic theory, which is kind of more related to the ancient Greek understanding of it rather
Atoms.
than the current physical understanding of it.
Right.
The translator made a possible note of a light source as being a possible precursor to an incandescent electric light. It looks like it might be more referencing static electricity or harnessing lightning, just due to the fact that that would have been what was known to him at the
Yeah.
time in the 1600s. But he really kind of covers the gamut here. There's an explicit reference to lodestone being used by moon beings, which a very early use of magnetism in literature. Quite a lot of things that are covered.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I was saying earlier too, it's my bad, I'm sure, but I didn't even realize that Cyrano de Bergerac was a real person before now. Before that, I thought
Well,
that
he's a
it was just
character,
some.
too.
Yeah, I thought it was a character in a play, and I mean it is, and that seems now more known than Cyrano himself in a lot
Yeah.
of ways. But it seems like he was a really interesting person as well.
The translator or the introduction to the edition that's on Project Gutenberg, this translation that I think we all read is
Yeah.
from the either late 1600s or early 1700s. So again, it has that same almost Germanic style of every noun being capitalized and lots of archaic spellings. But it gives a brief biography of Bergerac, and he's very roguish type character, getting into lots of fights and duels. And he
Yeah.
also had an extremely large nose, which he was very self-conscious about. And in the Moone version, there's a very clear linkage of nose size to penis size, which you also see come up in Tristram Shandy later
Oh,
on.
yeah, that's something I've always been curious to read, actually.
Oh, it's postmodernism 200 years before
Well,
Joyce. It's
amazing.
crazy.
That's really cool.
So
So
that was a really fun book. I think we should recommend.
Yeah.
I really think that anyone listening should really just try it out because it really is very funny and it's really interesting.
yeah,
And Moon is definitely the better of the two volumes between that and Sun.
yeah. I didn't really get through the Sun volume to be honest.
Yeah, Sun is longer. It starts with this really long and kind of tedious prologue, which initially starts with some interesting meta commentary on it, because
Yeah.
in the universe, he publishes the Moon Voyage, and everybody reads it, and he gets accused of being a sorcerer. And there's this like weird encounter with the devil, but he gets jailed, and there's this like prison escape where he
Yeah, I actually enjoyed that stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
But he in this one he invents this like prismatic light sail kind of device that uses reflections of the, I guess, light to propel itself. And by this, he accidentally gets himself to the sun, which is described as a planet on the solid ground. And, like the moon, he bounces from places to place and gets in misadventures. Encounters the bird people. There's a big discussion on, the language of birds. He gets imprisoned again.
Isn't there
yeah.
a
He
book
gets
called
thrown in jail a lot, doesn't he?
Yeah.
That actually happens in the Moon. Well, I mean, gets taken to court anyway. And yeah, it's just I guess his perspective on the Moon is as saying he comes from the Earth is kind of heretical. So it's probably a little bit of commentary there. I don't know exactly who Cyrano was thinking of.
Well, the moon itself is kind of cast as the Garden of Eden, where the sun is kind of made up of the spirits of everything that dies. So it kind of harkens back to the Dante model of paradise versus the non-believers in purgatory and inferno, where you have that kind of separate thing there. But on the sun, he hangs out with Descartes for a bit. They go see various rivers of memory, imagination, and judgment, where they hear a tale of this guy from the country of lovers where everybody is trained in sexual arts at a very early age.
Oh, the French.
Funny? I really felt, I forgot to mention this, when I was reading this, I could not help but think of Willy Wonka and the Great Glass Elevator. And if you were kids and you read that, and he goes up into space, and then he, with Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, and they like see all their dead relatives and stuff.
Yeah.
And there's like a whole planet of the dead, and there was so much about the way that this flowed. It kind of reminded me of the Roald Dahl novel, and it really reminded me of the Great Glass Elevator.
That's interesting. Yeah, the much less read sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Equally as good, just less candy.
Yeah, and I remember finding that book pretty crazy because there was a lot of death and some like horror, like the aliens invading the space station and stuff. But then it went off on all these weird tangents about the grandma getting really small for some reason, and I don't know. Yeah,
but it had that same weird. Ludicrous and ridiculous stuff.
Yeah.
So, what's our next story that we read?
That would be Voltaire. So this is from the 1700s.
Yes. So
Voltaire,
now we're talking about another Frenchman.
Yeah. So he's most famous for his picaresque novella Candide, which I can't recommend enough. It's absolutely fantastic. Yeah. But this is a very brief, I think it's the shortest one we read.
It was very short.
Another traveler story, except this time it's a twist where the traveler is not from Earth. He's from Sirius and visits Earth.
And he's really, really big.
Yeah.
They tell us this. And first he goes to Saturn, and he meets the people of Saturn, who are also really big compared to us, but very small compared with the natives of Sirius. And so this story plays a lot with perspective, and it's definitely very, it's not very subtle, but I really liked it. I thought it was funny. The style was very glib. It was very, you could tell he was having fun. And I don't know, I appreciated that. There was a lot of sly jabs at people, and a lot of some funny little puns here and there, and a lot of sort of I imagine it was sort of poking fun at figures in France that he might have been familiar with at that time.
He's definitely very cutting with his tongue and lays into the intelligentsia a lot. One of the quotes I pulled is, "It is best one should quote one doesn't understand at all in a language one knows the least."
Yeah.
This was very satiristic, and it was very glib, like you said. I mean, it was short, and it's a fun little story to read. And I don't know, it kind of reminds me of something you'd find in like a magazine. I don't know why, but it had that kind of casualness to it that the other stories didn't. Yeah. It was very casual, and I think I really enjoyed that because it made that a little bit more modern because of it was so casual.
Oh, definitely. It seemed very, very self-aware. Like, it definitely struck me as being a very modern style.
It's postmodern with the self-awareness, for sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely very on the nose with what it's talking about. He's not subtle at all at his digs.
No. But, so, he meets this academician from Saturn, and they become friends, and there's a little funny drama in there where the guy from Saturn's about to leave, and his girlfriend, who also happens to be... She happens to actually run the entire city or something, I think. I don't remember. She's like the matriarch or something like that. and she gets really upset with him because she's like, you don't love anybody, or just, like, and so they have this little fight before he leaves, and then they explore the inner solar system, and they finally make it to Earth, and everything's so small and cramped and tiny they can't possibly fathom that anybody could live there. And but they find a ship, and they're able to use their microscopes, and through some ingenious applications of homemade ear trumpets, they're able to communicate with these tiny little Earth microscopic beings. And
I like how they said they were all whales. They pick up a whale. Oh, look, it's inhabited by whales.
Yeah, these must be the people who live here.
These must be the people who live here, and they're just like a bunch of whales. Oh, these are so small, and then they find... Well, it's like Horton Hears a Who, right?
Yeah.
So I always love that idea of how infinitesimally small we are in compared to the vastness of the universe. And I love that Dr. Seuss-ness of it, where it's like, we're just bezel nuts or who's on a little who flower or whatever, bezel nut flower, floating around in space. And if nobody could hear us and we don't reflect light, nobody knows we're here. And so we're just this quiet blue ball that nobody can see. And I think that goes into that ego and perception. And I think ego and perception and how something thinks they're really big really isn't. And the Micromegas, even the name of the story, I was like, if I translate that, that's Biggie Smalls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it Biggie Smalls?
Yeah.
So you're always both at the same time, depending on how you look at things.
And it really plays with perspective, not in terms of physical size, but also time too. When he leaves the woman on the sun, the wife says something like, "I waited 500 years for us to be together." And I think Micromegas says that people live for 10,000 years, but they still find ways to complain about how life's not long enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely some real perspective tricks going on with this story.
So I really kept thinking, because I've read quite a bit of physics books, that's like what's used in, I have to get different hobbies, like I'll just all of a sudden get into something. So it really made me start to think, especially with how big, how small. If I was to translate the story into some kind of scientific categorization, it has the infinitesimally big, the infinitesimally small, and each of them have laws that are the same, but that aren't. So it kind of was like quantum theory versus like regular physics in a way, because the things that are small run in their own systems, and the things that are big can't explain them, but they can also see patterns within them. I don't know. That's kind of something I thought about when I was reading it.
And it's certainly this time, this is about a century after everything else we've written. The scientific discoveries since the 1600s have advanced quite a ways. So around this time, Benjamin Franklin published his seminal work on the study of electricity, which over the next century would dominate technologies, even though it is a bit slow to get started past Franklin.
And of course, microscopes are mentioned several times.
Yeah, right.
And that was also a fairly modern invention.
Yeah. The Leyden jar, I think, was pretty early. I don't know if it had been invented at the time of the... Yeah, it was. 1745 that was invented, which is an early capacitor. Micromegas was published in 1752. So there were devices and electrical apparatuses being developed at this time. So that kind of ties into the ideas of infinity and scale and scope. We also get a bit of a sense of the kind of scientific debate as far as astronomy goes at this time, where Phobos and Deimos are still not observed in the solar system by humans and are theoretical, but there's a debate going on whether or not they exist.
Yeah, and he actually
Voltaire
does mention that
addresses.
they mentioned that they found the two moons. I can't remember exactly what he said about it, but that stood out to me as well.
Yeah.
That's cool that he observed that.
Yeah.
So.
And this one totally rejects the idea of a universe centered on mankind, where towards the end of the work, each kind of school of thought represented by a different philosophical character kind of gives their elevator speech on what they think it is.
Yeah.
And the one guy quotes the old religious view of Dante, that the earth is the center of the universe and mankind is the center of the universe and everything is made for man, which causes both Micromegas and the guy from Saturn to
They
crack up
can't
and
stop
heavy
it. They
laughter.
laugh so hard that they laugh so hard that the ship falls into his pocket and they
Yeah.
can't find it again.
That's right.
So I thought the ending was really cute too, because these guys is like, "Oh, I'll write you a book on this," and then
That's right. And it was
the
empty.
secretary gets the book and he opens the book and the pages are blank,
Yeah.
and the last line is just like, "Oh, I thought so."
Yeah.
I thought it was really. I don't know. I think I laughed quite a few times while reading that. So I definitely recommend Micromegas. Sorry,
Super
to
quick read.
anyone who wants to read something that's short and that's written in a very modern style. And I mean, leave it to the French. It seems like for a while there, the French writers were really leading the charge in a lot of areas, not just what we're talking about now, but you look at a lot of the famous French works from the 18th century, early 19th century, compared with what was going on in England at the time. It's just on a whole different level sometimes, really pushing the envelope.
Yeah, Rabelais is incredibly obscene.
Yeah.
And that also kind of plays on the scale of gigantism that Micromegas does, and no doubt Voltaire was influenced heavily by him. But this is certainly a great story, and the edition I have of it is in Oxford cheap paperback edition, which has Candide and a couple other stories. So
Nice.
it's definitely something to keep a lookout if you hit up thrift stores and used book sales.
Yeah.
That this is probably more accessible than some of the other works, and the cheap
It is
paperback
very
edition.
accessible, and there is actually a really good audio reading of that I found as well.
Yeah.
So the guy puts a lot of emphasis on the humor of the situations, and this is really well done actually. So yeah, so those are pretty much the works that we decided to cover over the last few weeks, and I think we all did a lot of reading. Like I said, I didn't finish the second Bergerac, but I did enjoy the first one a lot, and I think we all really enjoyed some of this stuff, and even the things that I didn't enjoy, I thought were still pretty interesting, like the bacon, for instance. I'm glad that I now know firsthand what's being talked about when they, the new Atlantis is something that gets referenced a lot. So, I think for the future, we will probably have fewer works per episode to discuss.
A lot of these are very short, and we kind of had limited pickings for these, even though we do cover a really broad period of time. And there were a couple we left out, but post-Shelley, the genre gets much more populated. So there's going to be a lot to cover, and we're going to be focusing on longer works, I believe. Probably some shorter stuff too, but more focus on maybe novels rather than these kind of shorter works.
Yeah, although I definitely like
gonna-
to do some short stories too, because that's often my go-to to science fiction short stories, horror short stories, and so on. I enjoy reading those, and I think a lot of, especially when we get onto the 1930s to the 1950s, we'll probably find a lot of meat in the short stories published in the U.S. around that time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's.
So what's on the menu for next time?
So next time, we're going to discuss Mary Shelley, and there's a lot to talk about with her, and we're going to be discussing Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus, of course, but we're also going to talk about The Last Man, which is her post-apocalyptic novel that not as many have read, and I'm actually looking forward to getting into that. I started it, but I haven't gotten very far yet, so got a bit of reading to do for the next episode.
Yeah, and it's interesting about Shelley, as I was briefly looking into her other works beyond Frankenstein, and it looks like a lot of them, like The Last Man, were suppressed and not widely read at all. But I think we can all agree that Shelley is going to be a major pivot point for the genre, because it's
Yeah.
where we really see the first breakaway from this kind of imaginary traveler narrative and moving into more not only human agency beyond going from a place to place and using it as an example to entertain philosophical schools of thought or for satire, but creating things and the effects of technology and how that affects society, as well as more complex plot and character structures. Pretty much everything we read this time was 50 pages or less, so we're basically dealing with short satirical sketches where Frankenstein actually has characters who
Yes.
have character arcs and
Real conflict.
yeah, right. Things
Yeah.
happen.
So, that's something that I was hungry for during a lot of these.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Is it, and that's why I was happy to find a little bit of that in the Bergerac, because of like, oh, finally people have to struggle against something, right? It creates a little bit more engagement with your story when you know that they have to struggle against something, and so that's it's not something that you always see in some of these imaginary travel type works, because they're there to kind of make a point or make several points about us and where we're going, and not necessarily there to tell you a story for your own pleasure. So and I think that Shelley is generally considered the first science fiction author, and I think that pretty much every reference material that I've ever come across, they kind of very, very briefly mention the stuff that we mentioned today, but they pretty much go right to Shelley. So we've done an unusual thing in that we've actually sat down to read and discuss this stuff a little bit. We've actually given it more shrift than what a lot of science fiction historians seem to. So that's something that sets us apart.
Well, I think it's good to dig into this early stuff and kind of provide the state of what scientific thought and what literature was doing with it at that time throughout the course of history. Because nothing happens in a vacuum, and it's not just like Frankenstein came out of nowhere.
Didn't come out of nothing.
There were these precursors, and odd as they are, and they can be silly at times, and okay, well, is this really religious or science fiction, or is it this or is it that? It kind of misses the point that people have been using these kind of speculative and fantastic environments to portray different human experiences and reflect on the human condition that way for literally millennia.
Yeah.
Well, I think as we get further on too, we're going to start to have this foundation, because it is a context that is continually referenced and re-referenced and re-referenced throughout science fiction literature. It all comes back to classics. It all comes back to, and it is a repetitive cycle of how it's used and how it's referenced and how important it is to the propagation of our future sci-fi.
Yeah, and I think one of the definitions that, or one of the inclusions that people have in their definitions of science fiction is novel inventions. And I definitely think that a lot of these early works discuss a lot of novel inventions that were pretty far out, actually, some of them. And some of them are, impressive in the way that there wasn't really a lot of basis for some of this stuff, and yet here they are. Here we have Clockwork Men. Here we have what's basically a talking book. We have space travel. We have all these different things that were just, they may have had a slight basis in scientific thought, but a lot of it is, it comes from the imagination of a creative person who's thinking about what it might be like to experience these marvels. And so in that sense, I think that a lot of the work still qualifies, and it's definitely worth discussing. It may not be pure science fiction from our perspectives, but it's definitely prototypical.
And I think even in modern stories, we could see elements present that are in a lot of these.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm even just reading the Micromegas. I was thinking of a story called Surface Tension by James Blish. I don't remember the story terribly well, so it's actually one that I want to reread. But I think it was about microscopic people, and that may have once been human, but were now like reduced to a really microscopic size, and we're living in a community and everything. And it's called Surface Tension. I'm sure if people end up listening to this episode, somebody will tell me that I misremembered the story a little bit, but I actually have it in a book, so I'll probably end up rereading it soon since I thought about it. But
maybe we'll all read it.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I think that's pretty much all we've got for today. Maybe next month we should have another episode. Probably at the beginning of the month, say.
Yeah, I'd say that sounds about right.
All right. Well, thanks very much, guys, for doing this. We all had a really good experience with this, and
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
we're wanting to continue doing it, and eventually we may drop the chronology angle and just sort of move around a little bit more in time. But I think for these first few episodes, the chronological approach is a sensible one.
Yeah, when talking about genre, I think it's important to discuss the history of the pre-genre, if you will, because nobody was using the word science fiction even when Shelley was writing, or when Byrne was writing, or when Wells was writing. It was a term that came in later. So all
1926.
these elements, exactly, all these elements had to come together first before people would be referring it and thinking of it in that kind of genre sense. So getting to the roots of it, I think, is really important for understanding how it moves forward.
Yes, I think so too. And definitely we will we've already discussed definitions of science fiction, but I think when we get around to talking about the pulp magazines, that's when the term science fiction actually came about. And it wasn't really till then. And in fact, it wasn't called science fiction, it was called scientifiction. Thankfully that got dropped. Some of Hugo Gernsback's ideas didn't really stick, and that's probably okay. But we'll talk about him in the future.
Right,
and
so look forward to the Shelley, right?
Yeah, it's going to be a really fun episode. I've read Frankenstein before, and I'm really excited to read The Last Man because I like Shelley's style a lot. I think she does some really cool things with her characters, and The Last Man just sounds like it's such a cool setting. So I'm really excited to dig into it.
Yeah, I'm excited about diving into it as well. The background in the beginning is quite interesting. It's very stately. It takes its time. So I think when you say you love her style, you'll get a lot more of it.
Cool.
Even than you do with Frankenstein, because it's quite long compared to Frankenstein. So, yeah, it should be an interesting journey, and we will talk about it next month.